Okay, let me just give you a run through on the on this particular session. The flow of the talk is shown on the screen right now, but let me give you a little bit of context on this particular presentation. It's called the local evidence synthesis because it collates and tries to synthesize Singapore-based findings and research around a particular topic or a theme. And it is written in a succinct and informative manner, usually with each volume focusing on a specific theme, aimed at informing policy formulation, program design, and pedagogical practices in Singapore education. So there is a website on the NIE portal where you can find other local evidence synthesis reports as well. For this particular session, we have two experienced speakers who will share with us their findings on why school leadership matters. They will present for about 40 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A session of about 30 minutes, depending on how much time we have. The last part of the session will then focus on completion of the feedback form and conclusion. Let me introduce the two speakers. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Hairon Saleh. He is the Assistant Dean of the Office of Graduate Studies and Professional Learning and Associate Professor with the Policy, Curriculum, and Leadership Academic Group of NIE NTU. He received his PhD in Education from the University of Bath in UK, and then a Masters of Arts in School Effectiveness and School Improvement from the University of London Institute of Education. He teaches courses relating to teacher and leadership education, and his research interests and publications focus on school leadership and collective teacher learning in areas such as distributed leadership, teacher leadership, professional and learning communities, teacher professional development, and action research. Our second speaker is Dr. Jan Ho. She is our Senior Teaching Fellow and a Program Director for Teacher Professionalism and Learning with the Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice, NIE NTU. She received her PhD from NIE and a Masters of Science in Instructional Systems Technology from the University of Indiana, USA. She was a specialist with the Educational Technology Division of MOE, and she was a vice principal in 2 secondary schools. Her research interests and publications, like Hairon, focus on school leadership and teacher learning in areas such as distributed leadership, complexity leadership theory, teacher leadership, professional learning communities, and teacher professional development. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Hairon to begin the talk.
Right, thank you so much, Dennis. Okay, let's begin. Allow me to share my slides first. Right, as you can see from the title itself, why school leadership matters, a synthesis of local research studies. Right, this deck of slide of presentation emanate from our LES, local evidence synthesis work that we have done probably back in 2019, if I'm not wrong. And it has been presented to groups of different audiences, including MOE, senior leaders also. And these are the three people. We are the three people that have contributed to this work. Myself, Jean, and Poi Huat. However, Poi Huat will not be sharing with us today. Right. This is the overview today. What we plan to do is a brief introduction, followed by key insights to our local evidence synthesis, followed by recommendations on leadership practice and research recommendations. Okay, just a brief overview why we want to do this, okay? But before we move on to the why, let's talk about what is leadership in our definition. Leadership to us means influence on people to impact beliefs, values, and actions to achieve desired organizational goals. And when we say leaders, we're not just referring to school principals, but they include senior leaders like school principal, vice principal, middle managers, and teacher leaders, both formal and informal. And why leadership? I think most of you who are in education be very familiar with, what has been spoken about. What is most important in education is first teacher quality, second is school leaders. But some of my colleagues in other parts of the world will say that no, leadership comes first. But anyway, the reason is simply because they think that leadership influence all across the entire organization. So that's why they think leadership comes first. But according to Leithwood and his colleagues, leadership comes second. Okay. So if you see it that way, leadership is still very important in how it brings about school effectiveness and school improvement. But if you look at leadership in the Singapore context, what is interesting is that we are living in the education system in Singapore fits within this whole idea about decentralized, centralized education system. So Singapore is there's a uniqueness in Singapore education system whereby the challenge is that there's this constant aligning between central policy initiative and bottom-up school initiative. So in the past, we've always been in a way top down since independence, but then since the turn of the century, we begin to see some more and more bottom-up initiative. So leadership is caught in this or play a big role in trying to find a good balance between top-down and bottom-up initiative. And if you look at the current situation right now, also, there is a need for curricular or pedagogical innovations, or some of us would call it transformations, that is needed to meet a more broadened set of student learning outcomes. Right. Moving on, before we move on to cover the insights and implications, it's good to note that the local evidence synthesis is essentially a synthesis of final reports. So what we've done is whatever that is done in the past for the last 10 years or so, research that we have done relating to school leadership, we have taken the final reports and from there, we synthesize the findings. So I think this is a very important thing to note. Okay, so what are they? There are 14 ERFP studies, Education Research Funding Program studies that is pertaining directly on school leadership. We also have 15 ERFP studies with implications on school leadership, meaning to say that these studies are not directly about school leadership, but the implications has close relationship or implications to school leadership. And in total, it's about $3 million, which is 4% of the second and third tranche of ERFP funds. Okay, let's get to a more exciting bit here. Yeah. Key insights. So how are we going to move from here? Essentially, there are 4 key insights. I'll be covering the first 2, and Jean will cover the third and fourth. Okay, so you'll roughly go through insight 1. Effective school leaders play a critical role as culture builders. Insight 2, effective school leaders distribute instructional leadership. Insight 3, effective school leaders leverage multiple ecological levels. Insight 4, broad-based leadership development is critical for effective school leadership. Okay, let's look at insight 1. Okay, effective school leaders play a critical role as culture builders. When we look at culture itself, we take it as a more loose and broad definition of school culture. Okay, please take note of that. Right. So when you look at school culture, we see that school culture play a big part in how in the outcomes of schools, right? So what are these? What are the key features of positive school culture? The first one is about promoting teacher agency. So the studies that we have collated so far, that we have consolidated, seems to be pointing to the fact that, seems to be pointing to the importance of teacher agency. When you talk about, teachers being teacher autonomy, where they can make decisions in an open and safe environment. The second one is a culture that support collaborative and reflective learning. So school culture that promotes collaborative and reflective learning has a greater potential to impact positively on school outcomes. Third, encourage risk-taking, experimentation, and allowance for mistakes. Again, this is the third feature that we see in positive school culture where school leaders encourage risk-taking, experimentation, and allowing for mistakes. The way we look at it here is, this is quite key. In fact, if you look at all these features, they are in a way interrelated. Yeah? The first one is about teacher agency, but they don't work in isolation. They work in collaboration with each other. And then when they work together, they learn from one another through reflective practices or inquiry. And in this kind of collaborative spaces, they also take risk, and they experiment, and they inquire, and they try new things. And that's where teacher learning takes place. They encourage, to support, and they celebrate teacher learning together. The fourth one there that we put there is support learning, a culture that support learning that involves teacher epistemic change. This is quite an interesting finding, partly because we see that true change in a teacher really takes place in their epistemology, in the way they think about knowledge, in the way they interrogate knowledge, and in the way that they question knowledge and justify knowledge. I just want to take this time with just a simple story about from an interview that I had with a school principal. This school principal, a Singapore school principal, went to a country in in continental Europe. It could be, I can't remember whether it's Denmark or Finland. And the school principal was visiting schools. And in one of her visit, she asked one of the teacher, "Why do you teach the way you teach?" And the school teacher, replied by saying, "Oh, that's because we know that students learn best if they're put in this kind of situation. And therefore, we need to use this kind of pedagogy so that we can engage them, and so that we can enter into some kind of co-constructivist kind of thinking and all that." Then she carried on and said that, "Dr. Harry, when I come back to Singapore, when I talk to one teacher, why she or he teach the way he or she teaches, and the response back was, IG law, IG, instructional guide. In other words, this teacher teach simply because just following teacher's guide, and that's it. I'm not saying that all teachers in Singapore will be this way. I'm not generalizing here. Neither am I generalizing the teachers in the other country that the principal has given. But what is highlighted here is the idea of teacher knowledge, the way teachers acquire knowledge about teaching, the way they understand it, the way they justify what they believe to be effective in their teaching is important. So when teachers come in a culture where teachers come together, they work together, they experiment new things, they take ownership of that learning, and they take ownership of the decision they make about classroom change, that's when they engage deeper into what they assume or what their beliefs are about good teaching. So that's what that's what we find in our synthesis, or what we try to make sense of our synthesis. And in terms of impact, the studies that we found relate to impact on pedagogical competencies and also self-efficacy of individuals. When we talk about self-efficacy here, it's referring to individuals' belief in their innate ability to achieve goals, that include teachers and students. So that's for Insight 1. Let me move on to insight 2. Okay, so when we look at insight 1, is effective school leaders play a critical role as culture builders. Insight 2, effective school leaders distribute instructional leadership. So what we found in our synthesis of studies is that there seems to be a movement away from this, leadership as a solo leader. One person does not make the decision in that sense. So if you look at it in the Singapore school context, we have indeed been moving away from the idea that school principal is the only decision maker, especially with regard to curriculum and pedagogy. So what the findings that we have gathered so far shows that a more distributed approach to leadership is being employed here. What we term here is the idea of distributed instructional leadership. We know that instructional leaders are important, meaning leadership supporting classroom teaching is important. But over time, there is this need to distribute this instructional leadership to other members of the school. It's no longer the middle managers, which has always been in the past, even before the 21st century, the turn of the 21st century, but now more to the teacher leaders. So that's what we are beginning to see, that the instructional leadership practice have been passed vertically and even horizontally to teachers. So you can see that the emergence of both formal and informal teacher leaders. And this, in a way, reinforces the culture of collaborative learning. And in our studies, what we have seen is that this distribution have indeed impacted on student learning outcomes. So, yeah. So this is the second insight that we found, that effective school leaders distribute instructional leadership. Okay, I covered insight 2. I'll pass on this time to Jean.
Thanks, Hiron. Okay, so for Insight 3, what we found was that effective school leaders leverage multiple ecological levels. And what we mean by this in an education context is that we have the teachers at the micro level, we have the departments and the schools at the meso level, and in the Singapore context, usually the cluster at the exo level, and then of course the ministry at the macro level. So if you look at the first bullet point, at the teachers level, what we found was important was to give teachers space and the autonomy to interpret MOE's policies, particularly those that related directly to classroom practice. Just now, Hiron mentioned the importance of agency, and we found that when teachers were given the agency to interpret MOE's policies, it promoted their ownership of these policies. The second key finding was about the involvement of middle managers and teacher leaders. If you look at the slide just now when Hiron shared on the distributed instructional leadership, you'll see that the word intermediary was used. We find that for middle managers and teacher leaders, there was the potential for them to influence both upwards to school leaders and downwards or parallel to their peers and below. And when middle managers and teacher leaders were involved, there were connections, increased connections between levels. For example, between school direction and department work plans, or between department work plans and the teachers' implementation in classroom. I remember as a vice principal that we were very concerned about cascading. And I guess if you think about it, if we do want things to cascade from the school's direction down to the classroom level, this is where the more leaders get involved across the different ecological levels, the better it would be. And then next, there were 3 studies which found that a cohesive and clear curriculum vision at the school level provided the guidelines for the middle managers and the teachers to design, plan, and implement the curriculum. I managed to speak to the primary investigator of this study, and she was sharing that communicating this curriculum vision to all stakeholders, including students, also helps students to understand what to expect from the curriculum and what they could hope to achieve if they followed the curriculum. Okay. The other finding was that it was important for schools to capitalize on partnerships, both within and beyond the school system. In the school system in Singapore, for our foreign participants, we have a cluster of schools. We have cluster of between 10 or 11 to 13 schools. And so a lot of the cluster level provided a good platform to capitalize on partnerships, and effective partnerships at the cluster level involved teachers who are at multiple levels within the school. So to give an example, there was a cluster NLC that I studied. And in this cluster NLC, the principals were working with the principals of the other schools to establish the objectives for the NLC. The heads of department were working together to provide input on lesson plans developed by the teachers, and the teachers were also working together because they observed each other's lessons and they gave feedback to each other's lessons. So that's what we meant by involving multiple levels within the school. Of course, there is also the larger societal ecology, which will include parents. There was one study that looked at how a principal wanted to involve parents to support the lower achieving students. And so what he did was to come up with a vision, strategic vision for this to engage parents. And he role modeled commitment to this partnership. The study also found that it was important for the teachers, for them to develop the capacity to communicate with parents. Okay, so this also showed again that you do need to involve stakeholders at various levels. So not just the principal working with parents, but also the teachers as well. And they had to be sort of trained how to communicate with parents. However, there was one key problem that surfaced, and that was that leadership from teachers lacks upward percolation, in the sense that teachers were afraid to make independent decisions sometimes, or that they were afraid to take risks by experimenting with pedagogy that they were less familiar with, and they were not comfortable giving either negative feedback or disagreeing with their superiors. Okay, next insight. Thanks. All right, the other insight was that it was important if we wanted effective school leadership to have broad-based leadership development. Hiron shared about distributed instructional leadership. I shared in Insight 3 about having to, leverage leadership at all levels. So obviously, in that sense, it is important to develop all the leaders, as many people as we can, to exercise leadership. There were a handful of studies that looked into leadership development. Okay, for the school leaders and middle managers, there was one Tier 3 study that sought feedback from school leaders and middle managers on what kind of professional development supported them. And they said that they preferred a mixed model, a mix of formal and situated learning. So formal, in Singapore's context, we have the management and leadership in schools program for middle managers, and the leaders in education program or LEP for selected vice principals. So a mix of formal, situated learning in terms of on-the-job learning. Situated learning was incorporated into LEP in the sense that the vice principals were attached to a school where they were mentored by the school principal, and where they had to conceptualize and implement a project with the school staff. So in that sense, it was situated learning, though not in their own schools. The other features that the school leaders and middle managers said they appreciated were opportunities for networking. They also appreciate that there was time carved out for them to read and to reflect. When I was teaching one MLS course, that was what one of the middle managers told me, that she really felt privileged that she had the time to read and to do reflection. Vice principals and head of departments mentioned that mentoring was important to them. However, there was, of course, as usual, some critique of the formal courses. They felt that sometimes there was a disjoint between theory and practice. And so there was feedback given to enhance theory-practice links. For teacher leaders, generally studies found that it was important to involve teacher leaders in inquiring into their own practice, okay, experimenting with various pedagogies. Hiron mentioned the importance of collaborative learning, and this was mentioned again. Again, also the importance of situated learning. The idea of the concept of learning within networks was highlighted. We know that in schools now we have professional learning communities. Beyond schools, we have network learning communities. Okay, so these are opportunities for collaborative learning. However, it is not sufficient for teachers to just participate in networks. What the researchers highlighted was the need for a dialogic space. By dialogic space, they mean a space where opportunities are opened up for dialogue, whereby the teachers are not just co-constructing and developing resources, although that is important, but where they are critically examining their practice, they are problematizing what is taken for granted, they are challenging their assumptions and beliefs. Again, there was one problem that was highlighted. Hiron, if you could, thanks. Yeah. The problem that was highlighted was that when teachers were experimenting with new pedagogies, they did not seem to collect evidence, or when they did, they didn't analyze in depth evidence about students' learning. Yeah, so this was an issue that was raised that I think we might need to look into. Okay. So the next thing would be on, I think, recommendations, which I will hand back to Hiron to share the first two recommendations.
Right, thank you, Jean. All right, I just want to give you the broad overview about the 7 recommendations at the school level, bearing in mind that when we were synthesizing these studies, it is in the context of, the TSLN and TLN, Teach Less, Learn More, in a sense, yeah, policy initiative, whereby there's the need to balance top-down support and bottom-up initiative, and the need for school-based curriculum innovation and development. And this is where we believe that we are moving forward. So the 7 implications are, I think I'll just run through quickly before I go in details. 1, more teacher engagement on policy interpretation and implementation. 2, more teacher agency in developing and innovating pedagogical practices. 3, foster school culture, supporting collaborative teacher learning. 4th, support teacher learning that facilitates teachers' epistemic change. 5, more broad-based opportunities for teachers to develop leadership competencies. 6, greater focus on development of teacher leaders' competencies that have direct impact on classroom teaching. 7, school leaders to operate as network leaders to optimize school mobilization. Okay, I'll cover the 1, 2, 3, and 6, but in coherence, yeah, and Jean will cover the remainder 3, 4, 5, and 7. Okay, let's look at a recommendation based on insights: teacher engagement, agency, and leadership. Okay, these are the implications. All right. So what we see, the importance is that there need to be greater engagement, teacher engagement, agency, and leadership. So let's look at engagement. In terms of policy implementation, policy conceptualization and implementation, I think the old way of doing it, where the top conceptualizes and the bottom just implement what the top conceptualizes, can be problematic, or rather insufficient. Okay, because teachers are the final implementers of education policies, especially those relating to curriculum and pedagogy. So basically teachers need to know how policies are understood and implemented. However, the unique thing is that the understanding comes in when it is implemented. In the process of implementation, they will understand it. So in more completeness, in that sense. And I think this is understandable, right? Because we may conceptualize a policy that's relating to, let's say, curriculum or pedagogy, yes, but because every class is different, every group of students are different, every school is different, so how it is implemented is very much dependent on context. And I think teachers themselves need to be sensitive to these variations in terms of its implementation. Likewise, policymakers also need to know that, yes, how it is going to be understood is when teachers implement at the point of implementation. So, but having said that, it is important still to have the time and space for such engagements, and not to rush into it, and the time and space for it can be done in a more distributed manner also. It doesn't have to be directly from principal to teachers like that, but it could be more dispersed during department meetings or during PLC conversation. But sufficient to say that a one-time off communication with the teachers is not sufficient. Okay, it's really not sufficient. Like I mentioned just now, the understanding of the policy is only fully understood in its implementation. Meaning to say that when teachers, let's say, receive this whole idea about IBL, let's say, right, and then when it comes to understanding it, the teachers will sit there and see that as vague in that sense. It's just abstract, and the teacher will only understand it when it is implemented. And then in the process of that, the teachers will then reflect and ask themselves, is this really IBL? And then the communication will need to continue in the day-to-day practices of the teachers. And that's why we think such time and space are essential for the teachers to fully understand. I mean, we know in the past that one of the gripes that teachers make, not in Singapore only, but all across the world, that sometimes the pace of change is so fast that a teacher would have done something, or rather not done something, have embarked on something, a new initiative in pedagogy, and then only 6 months later or 1 year later, a new pedagogy comes in. And it is not surprising that some teachers may say that the change is just happening too fast. Or perhaps the implication is that not enough time and space is given to really talk about this, to really talk about the changes that need, the substantive change that need to happen. Okay, so that's about engagement, which affects agency in that sense, right? So an implication is that there need to be greater agency, teacher agency, in the pedagogical innovations and transformations, and that we recognize that in a situation that's more diverse, and the pedagogies that we are implementing becoming more diverse, and at the same time, it needs to be contextualized also in different classrooms. More and more agency need to be given to teachers. The teachers themselves need to, the teachers themselves know that they are the ones who can solve the problem. They are the one who can come up with the solution to their own classroom. Yeah. So the changes that we want to see in pedagogy and in curriculum cannot do without teacher agency, basically. Only this morning I was in a Zoom meeting with an organization in Thailand, actually. And one of the comments they make was, the ministry tells them what to do, yeah, and the teachers can write, and then the teachers come up with, and the teachers can write wonderful reports about what they've done, but actually not much has been done in the actual classroom, So we don't want that kind of situation where the teachers feel that I have to do this, and the result, as teachers may not actually do it because the force is coming from outside. The internal motivation and the determination must come from within. They themselves must want to do it. However, in a school setting, they cannot do it alone. This idea of collective agency, they need to do it with others. So the implication is that there need to be clarity in our communication to teachers, and clarity in our communication to teachers, indicating and telling teachers, and educating teachers that the solution is in the hands of the teachers themselves. An example is like PLC also, right? When you have a PLC, the teachers themselves must want to have PLC. The teachers themselves, in the meeting say that, yes, I want to make the changes that is needed. We need to make the changes that need to be made in our classrooms. I mean, it's no wonder and it's no surprise that AST and before that was, the Teachers Network, long ago, 2 decades ago, would already envision that for teachers, by teachers, that they are the ones who will make the difference in their own classrooms. And so what's the implication here is that we need to provide the resources, the time and the spaces for them to be internally driven with respect to curricular and pedagogical innovations and transformations. And this leads to the next point about leadership. Yeah, as we mentioned earlier on about the importance of teacher leaders, the collective teacher agency requires a more distributed approach in leading others. I know it's very loaded there when you mean by distributed approach, right? It means that teachers among themselves must learn to, you may use the word take turns in leading others to make the necessary changes in the classrooms. And that involves formal teacher leaders and informal teacher leaders. So there is the need to develop internally within schools teacher leadership. So the policy or the encouragement by AST and even classes soups. I know some classes soup really try to say that, schools, you need to build up your teacher leadership in your school, whether it be formal or informal, is a good step forward, actually. So when we look at teacher leadership, 3 aspects has been found to be critical in their roles here. One is to build collegial and collaborative relations. Second, to develop their own colleagues with respect to their learning and professional knowledge and competencies. And thirdly, to impact on classroom practices. We need to say that teacher leaders should not just be concerned about themselves, of their own classroom, but the classroom throughout the schools. Okay, but what we found also in our studies is that what is important is that what is most critical in this tree is actually the last one, impact on classroom practices. So schools needs to identify certain practices that makes the difference in terms of impact of impact. Let me give you an example here. If by a story, okay, I know two teacher leaders. They're my friends also in school, and we have this huge discussion. We have this huge debate about what are the roles of teacher leaders, and of course, at the end of the conversation, this is the question that we ask. Which is more important? Which is a higher priority as a teacher leader? To coordinate teacher-parent meeting or to observe lessons? And the surprising thing is one of them say that I'm okay with coordinating teacher-parent meeting. And the other one say, no, that should not be the priority as a teacher leader. And the reason that this person gave to say that it's okay to coordinate teacher-parent meetings because the impact is indirect. If you build teacher, the assumption here is that if the relationship between teacher and parents is very close, then the impact on the student learning is there because the student will be more behaved. You have lesser classroom management and all that. But to the other teacher leader, she said that no, if I have this amount of time, I would rather spend time observing lessons so that I can give immediate feedback and I can see the impact is more direct. So school leaders and teacher leaders in school must make that decision, to prioritize at the end of the day. And I want to reiterate at this point, in one of the studies that we've done, is that out of these three aspects of teacher leaders, leadership roles, the third one, impact on classroom practice, makes the biggest difference in terms of eventually impacting classroom teaching and learning. Okay, I'll pass on to Jean now.
Thanks, Hyron. Yeah, okay. I've combined two recommendations because they were both related to school culture and teacher learning. So if you look at the points, basically it's the importance of fostering a school culture that supports collaborative teacher learning and learning that facilitates teachers' epistemic change in teaching. As Hyron said, um, in order for teachers to really change their practice, they need to believe that students learn in a different way from what they currently believe. If they still believe that students learn best by me downloading information, then there will be very little change. And the next slide, next point. Okay, so it's not just about providing time. I think Hyron just now mentioned time and space, but he also mentioned the importance of how you use that space. So in our schools, majority of our schools are already providing time, which is great. You know, we're providing timetable time, usually during curriculum time, but it's providing the space and how are you making use of the space? First, for example, encouraging interdependencies instead of divide and conquer. Okay, so I give an example. I mentioned earlier that I have been observing a cluster NLC. And in this cluster NLC, we saw that they had designed interdependencies into the clusters NLC. What they did was that the teachers took turns to develop lessons for their peers to observe. But their peers then had to really sit in, observe the lesson, and they took notes. And then at the lesson debrief, they gave feedback and they give suggestions on how perhaps this lesson could be improved, not just for the teacher who was conducting the lesson, but for all teachers and to understand the topic that they were looking at. So that's what we mean by interdependencies rather than divide and conquer. For example, like you develop the lessons for primary 1 and I develop the lessons for primary 2. Okay, I mentioned earlier that there also needs to be a safe space for teachers to challenge assumptions and reflect on students' learning. And I think what we found that were useful platforms were action research or learning or lesson study. For action research, there was one study that I was involved in where teachers gave feedback that they were they were a bit scared of action research. I think it's because of the word research, but I think what is important is the process that the teachers go through, whether they're involved in action research or whatever other uh, well, whatever other thing that they want to engage in. Is about identifying the problem, the students' learning problem based on evidence. It's about reading and discussing literature that is related to that instructional problem. And then it's about trying out a possible intervention and then assessing the evidence to see whether that intervention worked or it did not work. Yeah, so I think what we want to emphasize is really how the safe space is being used by the teachers, because we are already providing time and we are already providing space. In terms of teacher outcomes, of course, we hope that this will see, and we do see from studies that it leads to an increase in teachers' capacity in terms of pedagogical content knowledge, and some transformation in teachers' beliefs in how they believe students learn and acquire knowledge. Okay, next slide. Okay, the other two recommendations are linked to the insight that school leaders need to leverage multiple ecological levels. In order to do that, school leaders will of course need to work as network leaders to optimize resource mobilization. But this means that they will need to develop a system mindset and disposition. In that cluster NLC that I was sharing with you, one of the school principals agreed that her school would become the lead school for that particular NLC. And she sort of released her head of department to facilitate the NLC. So there's a need to develop a system, mindset, and disposition, tapping cluster and ministry resources. I mean, since all schools have access to cluster, and cluster already provide you with access to schools with different expertise. And yeah, so that would be one area that you can tap. And finally, of course, school leaders would need to support teachers' contributions and involvement in networks. For that particular NLC, what the 6 schools did was that they released the teachers at least 1 hour before school ended so that they could travel to the other school. The other school provided them with lunch, and then they participated in the lesson. And after that, they stayed back and did the lesson debrief. So about 2-3 hours per week was actually set aside for the NLC. Okay. In order for school leaders, for us to have leaders leveraging multiple ecological levels, we need to provide more broad-based opportunities for them to develop the leadership competencies, not just within, but also across schools. In fact, the example I gave you as a network learning community is across schools, and of course, not just teacher leaders. For vice principals and middle managers, the study showed that it is important to sustain their professional development beyond the former PD platforms. So for middle managers, for example, they attend the Management and Leadership in Schools program, or MLS. But after that, when they go back to the school, they need support from school leaders to be able to enact what it is that they have learned. And for vice principals, this is also important because only selected vice principals attend LEP. So there needs to be development for VPs and MMs beyond the former PD platforms. Okay, next. Okay, finally, for my sharing, we're looking at recommendations at the system level. As I mentioned earlier, we already have formal programs for middle managers and for vice principals. So our suggestion is that in their reviews of these existing leadership programs, the Ministry of Education and the National Institute of Education could assess if the following competencies are being developed in our leaders. Are our leaders engaging teachers in interpreting and making personal sense of education policies? Are they perceived and supporting teacher-led pedagogical innovations? Are they fostering a culture of collaborative teacher learning and deep teacher learning? Are they involved in creating structures that support broad-based leadership development? Hiron mentioned this earlier. Are they enacting leadership practices that directly impact pedagogical practices and innovations? Yeah, for myself as well, when I look at this, I was also thinking of lesson observations, not so much the observation itself, but the conversation after the observation. Okay, giving the teachers feedback, but also checking with the teachers, understanding where the teachers are coming from and how they can help to improve the teachers' instruction. And finally, growing in network leadership competencies. If our heads of department, let's say, are asked to lead networks, are they able to design it so that there is interdependency, so that they can involve the other head of departments and the teachers in the other schools? Okay. The next one I'll pass back to Hiron. That would be recommendations in terms of leadership research.
Okay, thanks, John. I have only one slide for this. Essentially to summarize implications of research. The first one is, I think more research needs to be done on understanding leadership support on school-based curriculum innovation. I mean, we have done our baseline study on leadership many years ago. I think moving forward, we really need to fulfill the vision of this thinking school learning nation and top-down support, bottom-up initiative, really seriously looking at school-based curriculum innovation. Number two, leadership supporting effective policy implementation, interpretation and implementation. I think this is quite a niche area, the way I look at it, because how one perceive and make sense of policies and the relationship between policy conceptualization and implementation, I think a lot more can be done in that area. The third one is development of leadership competencies at all levels of leadership roles. So when I think there's much more room here to look into, not just looking at senior leaders like principal or vice principal or principal for that matter. I think more work can be looked at in terms of vice principals and even middle leaders, and of course teacher leaders. So there are gaps in those areas. Fourth, leadership supporting strategic partnerships, how schools work with other schools, of course, yeah, and how schools work with non-educational organizations like Microsoft or those private sectors, or how schools work with parents, I think that this fourth area could bring a lot of capital into school improvement, the way I look at it, because schools cannot solve everything. You know, societal problems uh, cannot be solved by just schools alone. It includes other players, other actors beyond schools also. I mean, especially homes. You know. Fifth is the methods. Implications on methods. I think we can be more interventionist, because I think we know what are the gaps and what are the areas that we can leverage, and we should focus on that. And we should adopt more mixed methods and perhaps more longitudinal study type to look at effectiveness or impact. More programmatic, meaning to say that instead of just using or drawing from leadership theories, I think we can look beyond that, from other disciplines. And lastly, translation. I think if you are doing actively doing research or in leadership, I think we need to think about how can our research be immediately translated to benefit the end users, whether it be teachers, whether it be school leaders, even policymakers for that matter. So that wraps it up for us for now. And I'll hand this back to Dennis.
Thank you, Hyron and Jean, for the rather very interesting presentation and sharing. We are now at a Q&A where we would like to invite any of the participants to either type their questions into the chat box, or if you'd like to speak, then please switch on your microphone and raise your hand, and I'll invite you to speak.
Dennis,
Yeah.
just some of them wrote in the chat, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So I have a question here from Phil, and he's asking, and here's the first question: what is the difference between leadership in schools and management? What's the difference between a leader and a manager? I guess is kind of where this question is getting at.
Okay, John, if you don't mind, allow me to answer. Is it okay, John?
Sure.
Okay. This question is like it's like forever question. It's like any first day lesson on leadership, this question always surface. If you go back to the typical business management literature, right? Leadership is a small part of management. Okay. Leadership is just one function or among others in management. I mean, that's from the business framework in a sense, where leadership means influence, then you have, planning or staffing and so on and so forth. So that's one way to look at it. Of course, there are other ways to look at it in terms of, then you ask yourselves, right? Don't leaders also manage? And the answer is yes. So that's another perspective to look at it. So leadership here is understood in a more loose way, in a more broad way, to mean the person who leads, in a sense. The person who leads also manages, also lead through its managing processes like planning, communicating. I mean, you can be communicating without leading. What I mean is without influence. You can be planning without influence. You can be developing other people without influence, So that's one way to look at it. Yeah. Jean, you want to add anything?
Yeah. Okay. Actually, if you look at the literature, there are multiple interpretations, but there is some concurrence that leadership is about deliberately exerting some form of influence to impact someone's beliefs, values, or actions because you want to achieve certain desired outcomes. Having said that, because now we look at shared and distributed leadership, sometimes the leadership may not be deliberate anymore. It could be just emerging from the situation. For example, especially for teachers, they may not deliberately be exerting leadership, and yet they can still influence. So I think the concept of influence is still there, whether it is deliberate or not. Yes. Whereas management, as what Hiron was saying, is more about planning, looking at into resources and all that. But for myself, I actually argue that they are very closely related, and that there is the degree of overlap is a point of a sharp disagreement, as one of the researchers said. Yeah, so for myself, I tend to, I do let them overlap a bit. Yeah, so because sometimes when you manage so that you can influence, and that's why when I was in school, I remember one of the principals kept saying structures drive behavior. Well, structures are management structures, right? But I think what he's trying to say is that sometimes when you implement certain structures, they can influence behavior. So if you think about that, yeah, management can be a form of leadership as well in certain ways. Yeah.
But maybe there is something deeper in this kind of trying to distinguish between leadership and management as well. A lot of the research that you've highlighted seems to suggest that leadership isn't just about looking at and trying to exert some kind of influence on the school, but it is about everything else that is also outside of the school, be it with other schools, with other partnerships. It's taking on that kind of systemic or systematic or even a systems view, right? And looking at it from a network kind of perspective. And it sounds like it's something that's very different from a fairly traditional understanding of what leadership is, which is almost like an administrator or a manager. Is that something that you're seeing that leadership, especially in Singapore, is no longer someone who's just there to take care of the school, but also have to be part of that greater whole?
Yeah. I think there is why you have the concept of system leadership versus, if you want the word versus, local leadership. Yeah, so the concept, and I think one of our ministers, I can't remember who, did say that school leaders should be network leaders. Yeah, so the concept of developing our influencing, okay, through developing our fraternity. Yeah, but of course, most important first is to lead in our schools, because it's also a lot of work to lead within one school. But definitely, there is the concept of moving towards system leadership. Yes.
But okay, so let me ask you another follow-up question from that one. And this is related to, I think, one point that was brought up about teachers struggling with some kind of an upward percolation. And this is with regards to the idea that you have both talked about culture, and people like Michael Fullan has of course talked about how difficult it is to sometimes change not just school culture but a broader national sense of what culture is. Okay, and the hint that you have in terms of the upward percolation point that was made is that teachers are afraid to take risks or make decisions because they still see whoever's above them in the hierarchy as being an authority, and likewise with leaders as well, whoever's above them. So there continues to be, while there's an attempt to try and change that top down pressure to a more bottom up initiative, culturally there's also a challenge because most people still believe that I better listen to my boss. How do you change that kind of a, how can leaders try and initiate a change in that kind of a culture?
Haron, you want to talk first, because I think I have someone cutting grass outside my house. I'm not sure that y'all can hear it.
Yeah.
The question again, Dennis?
It's the
In
idea
brief, in
of
brief.
cultural change in
Yeah.
schools as well. So there's a hierarchy that's always in place. It's been in place in whether you call it in our culture
Yeah.
or in schools as well. And that idea of a hierarchy and that leads to the top down kind of a mentality as well, right? That we just received instructions from the top. But we are now moving towards a kind of a more bottom up initiative. How can we change the school culture, which might be deeply entrenched in I'm just going to listen to my boss tell me what to do, to moving towards where teachers have far more agency to do so?
Okay, the way I look at it is, I mean, you're familiar with the term decentralized centralism, right? So
Explain
Singapore,
that to
yeah,
our audience.
yeah, Singapore, we are still holding on to the idea of we are still a centralized education system, And if you look at Hofstadter's work of, we still hold certain deep-rooted Asian values, of hierarchy, power distance, Of course, we are trying to do some kind of tweaking to that, but fundamentally is not change. So the way I look at it is that we are pragmatic, meaning to say that we will try to be non-hierarchical when it comes to pedagogies. So we provide the scope for you, and we provide this bubble for you. We provide this pedagogical bubble for you and say, okay, in this bubble, do what you want, But remember, there is this boundaries. You cannot have this, you cannot burst this bubble. You know what I'm saying, Janice?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the school leaders in Singapore have a harder time actually, because you're trying to be both. Okay, I need to have a hierarchical mindset, but at the same time, I need to show innovation, creativity, questioning. So that's the challenge actually.
Yeah. Actually, Hiron, I don't know whether you remember, because I got this from your study and Jonathan's. I
Right.
think there is some change though, Dennis. That For that study which Hiron did with Jonathan, there were teachers who wanted to have more say. And I think you might see that as we go along with the younger teachers coming in, there might be more of them that say, I want to have more say in what it is that I am doing. I don't want to just have it be top down. That's one possible trend. The
Mm.
other thing is that's why it's important to involve multiple levels of leaders, because no matter how open and let's say, yeah, no matter how open the principal is, if the principal sits in, let's say, in a PLC meeting, the teachers are going to they're going to feel more constrained, so they're going to, let's say, clam up. But one of the studies that we did with AST showed that when PLC meetings are led by teacher leaders, okay, even compared to HODs, okay, so when PLCs are led by teacher leaders, teachers felt that they were able to speak up more, whereas they said that when it's led by HOD, it's okay lah, we just listen to whatever she says, because she's a HOD. Yeah, so I think that's where if you involve multiple levels, it is important, and that would help that big power distance difference. But culture is very important, and it doesn't only impact teachers. There was one study I did where the vice principal actually said that if the school climate is very cold, I cannot be warm. Okay, so I think the whole culture is still important, and unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, because it does show that the principal still has a very big influence. Yeah, if the principal, I think, is open and willing to listen to ideas, I think it will percolate downwards. And if that percolates downwards, then I think teachers will be happy to give feedback, and it will percolate upwards. It's just that right now, teachers are still a bit wary. Yeah.
But I would agree with you, John, that you use the right word. Uh, you cannot do it alone. The school principal cannot do it alone,
Mm.
and that's why the senior. I mean, you ask any principal, one of the important things they need to invest in is actually the middle managers. The management team itself, right? And now we're beginning to see that if you talk about classroom innovations and all that, we need to build up our teacher leadership pool of people within their schools. I mean, in my study of teacher leaders, there's a difference between school A and school B. Let me give you an example. School A, there's only one or two teacher leaders in the school, and the other school, there are 12 teacher leaders in the school. You know the dynamics change. The one with the 12, there seems to be a momentum. There's a force moving. The one with the 1 and 2 is like I don't know what word to describe, but as if it's quite inactive, and it's not moving because it doesn't have the mass, the critical mass to set things in motion. And that's why one of the recommendations I give to schools resulting from these findings is we need to build our teacher leaders pool within the school, teams, community, that they can raise the level of teaching standards and teacher professional development higher, actually.
Okay, I have another question here from Mr. Cheong, which is kind of related to what we've been talking about. Um, the sense that as school leaders, you're going to be almost like not only just multitasking, but balancing different demands and expectations. So his question is, in the complex ecology in schools with such diverse students, teachers, SLs, levels, subjects, demands, and expectations, how can a school leader make sense in order to drive the school forward without losing sight of the everyday important granular needs? It's,
Yeah.
it's you have a slide which talks about leadership competencies. Is that something that you can share a bit more? How can a school leader perform almost like a sense making of the kind of needs that the school have, and then be more strategic, I guess.
Yeah, I responded to Chong, right? I mean, yeah, agree. Schools is really a very complex place. And look, I've never been a school principal. I've been a teacher before, and already that is already like kalam kabut, you know. But the school principals even worse. I know friends, close friends of mine who are school principals, and it takes a lot of metal, you know, to be a school principal in Singapore. You know? And I really respect them and honor them for the kind of work and sacrifices that they make. Not just them, but also the middle managers also. To me, when you talk about leadership, right, it's really about clarity of vision. I mean, you cannot run away from. You look at all leadership theories, right? One thing that stands out really is about vision, clarity in the vision, the purpose, and goals, and that's where and school leaders, their role is important because they they have the greatest influence to bring and draw resources, to synergize the resources towards this clear goals, you know, and clear purpose for the organization. So sometimes simplicity is the answer to this complex world in that sense. Yeah.
For my sharing, it's not really based on the research, based on my own experience as a vice principal in two schools under three principals. I think it's sort of similar though to what Hiron is saying. I think how my principal helped for the school to strive forward is, I guess you need to decide, I mean, strive forward towards what? If you're trying to strive forward towards a lot of things, then of course, yeah, you know, you have all these everyday needs, and then how do you cope with them? I think she prioritized for us at that point in time what was important, and so we had a clear what we were striving towards, and we also took the time to do it. I mean, after 3 years, we saw results. So I think sometimes it's also about persisting. I remember she shared about the flywheel. I think that's from the learning organization, and how you just keep pushing the wheel until eventually it flies. Hopefully, yeah, it did for us. Yeah, so I think that's how we strive forward. But of course, we still had to deal with everything, everyday needs, especially at the vice principal's level. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question, and another question from one of the audience members. What is your view on content specific leadership? Is there such a thing, especially in, like, for example, STEM schools? Did you get a chance to study any kind of STEM schools? Anything different? I guess it's the idea that is there a difference between a more generic notion of leadership or versus a more disciplinary notion of leadership? Is leadership in science different from English, etc.? That's one. Is there a difference in terms of leadership across different types of schools as well? So the more specialized schools versus the more government schools versus government aided.
If you're looking at the um, 20 over studies that we analyzed, okay, for this LES, I don't recall. Okay, there was a study. okay, I guess we can be open because you don't know which report it is. There was a study of SOTA, School of the Arts, because we usually have to keep confidential what we're studying. So I don't recall STEM, but okay, there was a study of SOTA. But based on that report, the leadership was more at the level of the school curriculum, and it wasn't an arts curriculum. This was the one that I mentioned just now, whereby having a clear and cohesive curriculum could help to guide the teachers' planning of the curriculum. Based on what the primary investigator told me, she said it was called the connected curriculum. But I don't have details, but it didn't sound like it was an art curriculum. So I right now, based on the reports that we have, I didn't really notice any content-specific leadership. But this is an interesting topic, especially if we start looking at leadership by middle managers, because a lot of, if you look at subject heads, and we know that for teachers, they identify with the subject area, right? So it is possible that if it comes to a subject head, that there might be content-specific leadership. But we currently don't have any studies on this. And if I recall what I read from the literature, there's not so much literature on middle management. I don't recall any that was content specific as well. Hyron, maybe you've come across some.
Not really, but I must, that question has been raised to me personally, in terms of content. A school leader, would the school leadership practices vary from one content to another, or from one school to another? Of course, to me, the answer is yes. I mean, although there are some universal features that good leaders show across whatever context, personally for me, good leadership is one that is sensitive to the followers, to the context. Everything is contextual in that sense. I mean, for yourself, let's say you're vice principal of this particular school, and if you go to another school that's very opposite of your current school, don't you have to change the way you relate to people? I think it only makes sense, right? Yeah. So I think there would be a difference in the way leaders enact their leadership practices because of the changes and variations in context. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. In light of the importance of teacher leaders in the school environment, how do you see the role of teacher leaders evolving in the middle and long term? And what can school leaders do to aid this evolution?
Yeah, I just
I think I just saw Hyron respond to that as well.
Oh, that's a very quick one.
Verbally say that.
Could I elaborate? I mean,
Yeah.
it's faster to elaborate. I think first and foremost, I mean, like I said to you earlier on, the presentation earlier on, is that there is a huge variations across school in terms of this is my hypothesis. There's a huge difference in terms of how people view or place importance on teacher leaders. I mean, the fact that you can see that I used to do this every intake of MLS, participants in a big lecture or in a Zoom lecture session. I would ask you, how many of you, I do a quick poll. How many of you have one teacher leader or two teacher leaders? How many of you have 8 or more? And it varies, across. And the average is about 4 or 5 per school. But there are cases that there's only one teacher leader, the extreme ones, and there are 2, and there are extreme cases where there are 12. So, and it shows different things. Some schools are better at identifying and grooming and developing teacher leaders. Some schools are not. And I say they are not. I mean, it's not that they're not good. Maybe the other factor is they don't prioritize, they're not able to prioritize it. Another factor could be teachers themselves may view teacher leadership career trajectory as not so fulfilling for them. So there's lots and lots of reasons why school A cannot develop the critical mass for teacher leaders in that particular school, and while another school they can do a better job at it. In my own study about teacher leaders, you'll be very surprised. One of the implication is that we need to come up with a video, a short video clip to show to other people the role of teacher leaders and the importance of teacher leaders that they can aspire to, and all that, so perception is the other thing, when that person actually gave that kind of suggestion, that we need to have a short video to educate people about what's the role of teacher leaders, and also to say that, yeah, they play an important role here, So to me, teacher leadership is the next wave of school effectiveness. Yeah.
Yeah, Hiron, I was going to say, there are teachers that we might think are good teacher leaders, but it takes a lot of time to convince them to become teacher leaders because they want to remain hot, okay?
Yes,
Happy
yes.
ordinary teachers. But of course, there are also, to be fair, I think there are also schools where perhaps, the number of good, I mean, you also don't want to promote anyone to be a teacher leader, so you do need to
Yes.
be careful about that. But in terms of how do you nurture, how do you develop them? You see, and especially in schools where there are very few teacher leaders, or there's only one, anyway, usually you only have one teacher leader, let's say of maths. I think this is where the NLC plays a very important role. In our recent study, we are looking at 7 NLCs, and I can really see that when the teacher leaders come together across schools, that is where they can learn from one another, and they can also then they can bring to the NLC, issues that they face. They can bring back suggestions of the NLC. So I think for teacher leaders, NLCs might be even more important than PLCs, because in schools, PLCs, they are leading, whereas in NLCs, where they meet other teacher leaders, they are also learning at the same time how to be a teacher leader. And in the example that I gave, there was one school that she wasn't even a teacher leader. She was, I think, identified as a potential teacher leader. And she was asked to help the HOD to facilitate the NLC. And we could actually see this teacher growing, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And the following year, we heard that she was formally appointed a teacher leader. So I think if school leaders, you want to help the evolution of teacher leaders, especially STs and above, I think this is one way to really harness the cluster network.
I have a question. Among your presentations, you've highlighted some of the um, fairly important characteristics and competencies of school leaders. Perhaps if you could talk about what would be, say, or from whether it's from your research or from your own experiences or from your conversations with school leaders, right? What are the top 3 challenges of leaders in Singapore, school leaders in Singapore?
Which school leader? School leader, P and VP and HOD and teacher leaders will all have slightly different challenges.
Let's talk about the top ones. Principals then.
Principals. Okay, because I did a study on vice principals and I was a vice principal myself.
Let's go with vice principals then.
So I guess one top challenge would be being the intermediary, because that is both something that is an advantage, something that they can tap on, and an issue if there is a disjoint between what the principal believes is important and what the teachers want to do or how they perceive. So that was one key challenge that came up. Yeah, principals, I'm not sure. Hiron? Did your studies show?
I think all school principals will have to, like all other educators, have to challenge is really about the time, isn't it? The kind of complexity. I mean, like one of our colleagues mentioned, right? The complexity that they have to make. I mean, that they face every single day, and the kind of resources that they need to put into it and dealing with it. It's like a war zone, and so the kind of quick thinking that they have to make, and the decision that they have to make is really snappy on the spot, I think that is something challenging but exciting lah. Some people thrive in it. They say, I love this job because of that. Some people may find that, oh gosh, this is like a waste of time. So the kind of decision making that they have to make, I think that would be the main challenge. It's not about quickness of it. No? I think that the problems that they face are much more complex, and the kind of energy is really sapping, of the energy. they have to think through, and some of the issues and dilemmas are really dilemmas. It's like there's no quick answer. There's no answer that make everybody happy, and you need a lot of wisdom, to make the right decision, that just the sweet spot decision, that is at best for the moment. Yeah, that's what I can think of, decision making.
I mean, we've heard various metaphors being used, networking, intermediary kind of thing, and now I guess school leaders as battalion commanders, even plunging into a war zone. The last question, I'm mindful of the time right now. The last question is this: a lot of what you've reported in this local evidence synthesis is a retrospective analysis of all the final reports of the leadership studies that's been conducted in NIE over the last X number of years, right? What are your thoughts on the kinds of leadership competencies that are needed, especially post 2020, post COVID-19 pandemic? You've talked about complexity, compressed time, the energy kind of required, and in this particular pandemic period where there's a lot of messaging coming in at one point, and decisions have to be made on the fly very rapidly and all that. So what are your thoughts? Maybe some closing thoughts about the kinds of competencies moving forward that you might think that school leadership or school leaders will need to have in order to deal with this kind of even greater, even more complex, uncertain scenarios that we might be encountering in the future as well.
Hey Jean, I'm thinking about the LGM. Do you think it's sufficient?
What's LGM?
The leaders growth model,
Ah.
which has a range of competencies, like being network leaders, I think instructional leadership. I can't remember all the details. Yeah, but there are competencies there. I don't know. I'm not sure that. I think the LGM is sufficient in that sense. I mean, it's very all-encompassing. I think more, it's not so much competency. I think if you want to look at how to help teachers right now, I think it's more empathy and understanding, and therefore also because everything is so new, we're doing blended learning. There is the in one-to-one implementation. There are a lot of things that the teachers are grappling with. So like what Hiron said, empathy, giving them time to work it out, because they need to make sense of it for themselves. And anyway, there's no right or wrong way to do all these things. So I guess if you are not in a hurry or rush to get anywhere for this kind of things, empathy and giving them the space to really think about what is it they're doing, so that we don't end up doing things for the sake of doing things.
Hiron, any thoughts on?
For me, I mean, I don't know. I mean, okay, not that I don't know. It's just there's too many, too many to and I'm trying to like think about, okay, if you want me to give an advice, like what, Nike, just do it. I don't know, what came to my mind actually is about complexity, that the world is more complex now. And so what kind of competency do you need in order to handle complexity? I mean, you need resilience, grit, patience, empathy, and you need some kind of a lot of strategic thinking, involved. You need to be aware, you need to scan your environment, you need to know different stakeholders' needs and demands, um, and being aware of that to make decisions in terms of, okay, so based on all this, where should we move on? What should we prioritize? What can we simplify in order to cope with this complexity? And yeah, I mean, to me, the challenge is really about complexity. How can we take advantage of this complexity and use it to our advantage? How can we take this complexity and use it for our advantage, for the purpose of to meet the school vision and goals and priorities?
And I guess if you want to sort of round it up, I mean, if complexity is really the main challenge, That's where you really need multiple levels of leaders.
Yeah, of
You need
course,
multiple
definitely. Yeah,
people to
yeah,
help you think it through.
right.
And the only way you can do that is to respect the teacher's autonomy and give them the space to also think about it.
And the middle managers also, yeah.
Yeah, of course, everybody. Yeah,
And
I
that's
think you
why,
cannot.
and that's why over time, this is what I'm beginning to see, the so-called younger school principals, right, learn to let go. They learn to let go. They need to say that I cannot do this alone. I need to do this together with my middle managers. And when I do it, I let go in that sense that I don't have to like micromanage, they can handle it. And I need to trust that they can do it. My job is to just develop them, provide monitoring, provide coaching, provide the right resources for them. Likewise for the teachers also. So the multiple levels of distribution in terms of coping with the complex, increasingly complex, and thankfully no more Donald Trump world.
Okay, with that, I think we have to close this. And I think at the end of the day, the term "it takes a village" applies quite aptly here. I want to thank both presenters, John and Hiron, for sharing your expertise and your findings on leadership, and for a very vigorous and robust Q&A. And to everyone, thanks for attending the session. And if you have not downloaded the LES report, it is available here on the QR link. You can have a look at the full report. And when you do cite it, of course, please cite it using proper APA standards. Um, with that, I want to thank everybody for attending this seminar. And I believe there is another OER professional development series coming up fairly soon on methodologies. So please take note of when that's coming up. Thank you very much.